Welcome to the Faith and Business Podcast. I'm your host, Elle Edwards, mental health champion, happiness geek, and founder of the Faith and Business Playground. Join me each week as I talk openly about mental health, the dark side of entrepreneurism, and bring you Bible-friendly tools, support, and resources to help bring more joy to your journey. In today's episode of the podcast, I am sharing with you a little bit of my story. This is not a part of the story that I've talked about before. That is going to change because if you've been listening along for the last little while, you might have seen how the Faith and Business Playground has iterated and how the podcast has tweaked and adjusted as we go. Because I really do believe that this work is something like at least 8 years in the making. What some of you, just a small handful of people listening might know, but most people don't know that 8 years ago, I had a website called Go to Elle. And 8 years ago, I wrote about my frustrations with why everybody had to pretend. If you go to faithandbusinessplayground.com/about, you will see my about page. There's a little introduction that says hello and there's my photo, but there's a conversation there where I recorded some of my honesty statements. I wrote that back in 2011 and I was challenged a couple of weeks ago to really explore what it is that I'm here to do with the Faith and Business Playground. And long story short, I've always wanted to create a safe space where people could be themselves and be honest and just talk about how they're really feeling. But I never really stated that explicitly in any of my marketing materials, none of my website copy. And so as much as I've always been a mental health advocate, and as much as I really do believe that each of us has a part to play in that, I've never really talked about it much. And I definitely haven't talked much about the journey that I've been on. And so this episode of the podcast hopes to rectify that a little bit. Because some of you will have heard me tell you that if you'd have known me, let me think, maybe 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't have recognized me as the happiness geek and the silver lining spotter that I am now. I am definitely a different person now, or at least I'm showing up differently now than what I was 10 years ago or so, because I remember very, very clearly, even further back than that, my eldest daughter is now 16. When I was pregnant with my eldest daughter at 16, my husband and I had sold our house in Brecon. We'd moved back in with my parents while we were waiting to buy a house closer to home. Long story, various reasons why we moved. I didn't really settle in Brecon is the short version of that. So we had the opportunity, the housing market at the time was great. So we had the opportunity to move closer to my family. But we were in this position where we'd sold the house in Brecon, but we hadn't completed on the house we were buying here in Llanelli. So for a few months, my husband and I, while I was pregnant with our eldest daughter, we moved in with my mum and dad. Now, I have one very clear memory, and I offer you this part of the story by way of example of where my head was at. I have this very clear memory of my sister, my newly married sister, and her husband coming to my parents' house, and they brought their wedding photos to show mum and dad and everybody. And I don't know what triggered it. And I've actually spoken to my sister about this to ask her, like, why did I react the way I did? She has no memory of that event whatsoever. I can only assume I was jealous. I don't know. I honestly can't remember what triggered it, but I remember flying into an absolute rage and being so angry and upset and frustrated and shaking and tears, and so much so that when I'd gone upstairs and threw myself onto the bed in distress, my mum came and said, "Look, you're going to have to calm down. You're going to hurt the baby otherwise." And as I hear myself telling you that, I almost don't recognize myself, because I'm like, why would I overreact like that to some wedding photos? I have no idea. It's just so far removed from the journey that I've been on. But fast forward a few years, and I remember as a young mum, by the time I had 3 children and we chose to start a family, I was 24. So not that young, but not that old either. 24, 26, 28, having these children. And all I ever really wanted to do was fall in love and get married and have a family. But the flip of that, there was something inside me. I just felt so frustrated and so constrained and so pent up. There were days when I would just feel so angry and shouty and overreacting to things for no real reason. Like if the children were just being children, and children can be really annoying sometimes, let's be honest, but they were just being kids and just completely losing it and having to step away and just being so frustrated I wanted to scream. And being quite candid, there are occasional moments now when I can feel that pent upness in myself. So this idea that even the people that we show up as in the world, because if you'd have anybody from the outside looking in, on paper I had everything. Like I had a nice home, I had a beautiful family, a husband, everything was wonderful. There was no reason why I should feel so frustrated and cross and angry and bleh, I haven't got the word, so I'm going to give you sound effects instead. But that was almost part of the problem. And so this is what I was challenged with a couple of weeks ago, and it actually started prior to that as well. I hinted at this part of the story, and one of my friends said, I've never ever heard that story, because we don't like to tell the stories of us in a not very good light. Well, this episode is me changing that, because I, for one, am ready to step forward and show you the not nice pieces, because my hope is that if I can show up and share a little bit of what's going on in my head and has on in my head, it will help people feel less alone, because I believe that it's not just me. I can't be the only person who's had that feeling of frustration and just narky and irritated and angry at the world, but at the same time feeling so guilty. Because quite often when we hear stories of overcoming and doing battle with stuff. So people who've lost parents, people who've lost children, people who've lost limbs, people who fought cancer, all this big stuff out there, that's not part of my story. I had a miscarriage in between my second and third child, and I remember crying for a week, and then a week later I was a bit bored of crying, and the month afterwards I became pregnant with my son. And so that was probably the one of the only sort of challenging things that I ever had to deal with. And lots of people have miscarriages. That's not really like a big dramatic thing. And there's this danger. We see all these stories and hear the stories and of people overcoming really big stuff. And then we look at our lives, and by contrast, there's nothing really wrong. We shouldn't feel like this. And you might have heard me before share my frustrations with the word should. I don't like the word should, because it has expectations attached to us. And what I guess I want to, if there was one thing I want to take away from this episode, is this idea that you don't need to negate how you're feeling. How you are feeling right now, and how you're feeling on good days and bad days, and those days when everything is just too much. I don't want you to negate those feelings. I don't want you to feel guilty for feeling like that, because just because there are things happening over there that on paper you think are way, way worse, that doesn't make your pain and your suffering any less. You don't feel, if I was to chop off my arm, for example, I'm not going to chop off my arm, it would be really inconvenient. But if I was to chop off my arm, that wouldn't make somebody dying of cancer be less awful. And the fact, if somebody else chopped off my arm, the fact that there's somebody over there dying of cancer wouldn't make my arm hurt any less. And so part of what I'm exploring as we move forward in the Faith and Business Playground is just being real about what's going on, and recognizing that each of us have a very unique, for us, we all have our own journey through this world. We all show up on this planet, and there are times when it's not great. And so I want us to do what I can to stop feeling guilty, and stop, thinking, oh no, we shouldn't feel like this because that's somebody else's experience. It reminds me actually when back in January 2017, which feels like 5 minutes ago, but actually it was 2 years ago. How crazy is that? Back in the start of 2017, I was feeling really rotten. I was lethargic. I had no focus. I had some bottom symptoms, shall we say. I was just, I also remember feeling like driving the car and then feeling nervous for no reason. Just really wasn't myself. And so it got to the point where I was just, something isn't right. And so I remember sitting in the doctor, went to go and see the GP, and she took me through this, I think it's like a depression questionnaire. I never had one of them before. I'm assuming that's what it was, and asking you to like rate how you're feeling and all that sort of stuff. And I remember saying something along the lines of, look, like, you know, feeling a bit rotten and the anxiety and depression stuff, that's not my thing, that's my husband's thing. And she said to me, well, just because he is struggling with stuff, you don't need to deny how you're feeling. And I thought that was quite, at the time, I just was like, okay, whatever. I wasn't ready to hear that. But I think it's very relevant to this conversation we're having now, because lots of us, I think, are going around on this planet having times in the day where we're not feeling brilliant, and everything isn't feeling great. And we maybe don't get to the point where it feels so awful that we go to the doctor. Maybe we don't have clinical depression. We don't have diagnosed anxiety. We're not bipolar. We haven't got any of those clinical labels. And yet something isn't quite right. And it's that space that I feel called to speak into. Because quite candidly, I'm not medically qualified to deal with clinical depression, for example. But I think there are people, you know, we talk about, oh, I'm so depressed. This is the problem as well. Labels are a bit of a nightmare. People will say, oh, I'm so depressed. And what they really mean is actually they're not having a great day, or they're not having a great moment in a great day. And that the danger of that, it does two things. It's dangerous to people because if you're really struggling with depression, you know, if the black dog, as it's been described, you know, you will have good spells and bad spells. And if you're in a particularly not great spell and you hear somebody else going, oh, I'm so depressed, it's so far removed from your reality. Full on depression, when you cannot see any way through it, where you cannot get up out of bed possibly, where you feel like this is never going to end. That's a vastly different experience to somebody who says, oh, I just feel depressed. Just incidentally is not a great word to add to that anyway. So the problem is it's such a language. One language is wonderful, but there are only so many words in existence on the planet. And this word depression gets bandied about. This word anxiety gets thrown around. And yet it's a spectrum. And so if you're somebody listening to this and you haven't been to the doctor because you don't feel bad enough, and so maybe you almost push that label away, I want us to start being real about how we're actually feeling, and creating a space where we can talk to each other and we can notice if somebody isn't quite themselves, and we can reach out and just be a friend, because there aren't any magic solutions to any of this stuff. You know, if you are struggling with anxiety, for example, and my youngest daughter, some of you listening will know that like last year, she started really struggling, and we joke because this is my humor. I like to, you know how you laugh, we call it dark humor. You laugh because, you know, otherwise you would cry. She woke up crying on the morning of my 40th birthday and cried every day for weeks. And I joke that she had my midlife crisis for me. It's not really funny, but it's just my way of sort of like, you know, getting through it. And at the moment, touch wood, I know that's not a Christian thing to say, but we all say it anyway. At the moment, thankfully, she's having a good spell. But what I've been forced to recognize, and it's a challenge, but I've been forced to recognize that actually there isn't any fix to this. It's about taking it one day at a time. And so the more that we can be open about these conversations and actually get real about how we're feeling, the easier it will be. If someone's not having a very good day, they can just be honest about it. And that was one of the things that came up in Time to Talk Day on February the 7th, was that people sometimes, I work from home, self-employed, so I don't have a lot of experience in the office environment. But if you're having a bad day in the office and you really can't admit it because there's this stigma. And so I want us to try do what we can to try and help end that stigma. The other part of this, for me personally, as a person of faith, is I get saddened and frustrated and really quite angry when I hear stories of how poorly church is treating other Christians. So I have a friend who got kicked from a Bible study group because she mentioned the fact that she's bipolar. That's not love. That's not kind. That's not supporting people. So my other big part of this is I want us to acknowledge that there are people in the church, because there are people in the church. If there are human beings in the church, then there are people who have mental health issues in the church. And I said, you need to listen, actually. That reminds me. If you haven't already listened to the Mindset Minute from Wednesday. So what I said on Wednesday, if you are human, then you have mental health issues. This label, mental health issues, it only serves to make that stigma even worse. We don't talk about you having physical issues just because you need to pay attention to what goes into your body. Like it's good for us to eat fruit and vegetable. It's good for us to drink enough water. It's good for us to move our bodies. Those things that we do to care for our physical bodies, they're not issues. And yet suddenly, if we try and talk about the things that we can do to help protect our brain and what goes on inside our heads, that becomes an issue. That's rubbish. If you're human, you've got mental health. If you're human, you need to be looking after yourself. And so so part of this as well is about recognizing that, in some cases, Christianity, church as an institution, isn't doing a great job of loving on people, and is maybe making it worse. And so I want to try, if nothing else, to offer an alternative, to be a safe space where you can be a person of faith and you can look after your mental health, which relates to this incidentally. If you're not already in the Faith and Business Playground community on Facebook, I would encourage you to come and join us. If you go to faithandbusinessplayground.com/join, you'll see more information and you can join us, because I want us to have these conversations. I want us to be able to admit and acknowledge and talk about how we're feeling. So to try and bring this to a bit of a wrap up, because this episode is slightly longer than I intended it to be, we will have good days and bad days. We will have good moments in bad days and bad moments in good days. That's what it is to be human. God loves you regardless. God is loving on you the whole time. And what I want us to do is do a better job of loving on each other. Because if we can't love on each other, other Jesus geeks, if we can't love on each other, what hope have we got of demonstrating that love to people who don't know Jesus yet? And that's the big part of it as well, is that I believe that you are an important part of God's story. My illustration for this is when we play music in church. So we have clarinet, trumpet, bass guitar, piano. And if one of those pieces is missing, we get by. It still works. But when we all come together, all the harmonies come through, and all the extra lines and the melodies and those different bits. You are part of that music. You are part of that melody. You have a part to play. And yes, the song will continue without you. The song will manage without you. God's song will be heard whether or not you are in a position to shine brightly. But it's not complete without you. It's not as God intended if you're not part of that music. And so that ultimately is my why. Why are you doing this, Al? Why do you care about encouraging and equipping and empowering other Christians and helping with this work? That's the reason why. Because you are vital to this music, to this story, to God's story. You have an important place in the world, and there is nobody who can be you other than you. And so I want to help equip you and empower you and nourish you as you grow in your faith and become this person who can shine brightly on the good days and on the not so good days. But you can show up and be yourself, and you can feel loved and equipped to do that work. So that's sort of, I don't feel like I've told you all of the story yet, but that's the start, I guess, of the story. That's where I was. And it's been a journey, and most days I'm, pretty showing up with a smile on my face. But I will admit, I'll quite happily tell you, there are still times, not every week, but at least every couple of weeks, every month maybe, there are times when I'm really grumpy. And that will surprise a lot of people listening to this, I suspect. Because until now, I've only ever shown you Smiley Al. I've only ever shown you me showing up on a good day. Not that I hide away on the days when I'm not feeling brilliant. I just do a great job of putting a smile on my face. That's going to change, because the more that we can show up and be real about what our journey looks like, the more we can empower other people to do the same. Okay, now then, if you've been listening, like I say, if this resonates with you, I am looking to build a community so that together we can encourage each other. So a reminder, faithandbusinessplayground.com, if you want to find out more about, my thinking behind all of this. But the page to actually join us, faithandbusinessplayground.com/join. It's free. I do paid coaching work as well, but this is free. And I would love for you to come and join us. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening for this very long episode. I look forward to catching up next time. Take care. Bye-bye.